Well, today we're talking about trusting in the waiting. We're in this in-between season as we race toward what we know is coming, and there's lots to occupy our thoughts and our schedules. But we're kind of in that moment right before where we get to take a breath, if we will allow it, and let God show up for us and speak to us and lead the way. But it does, of course, require the pausing, and that's what we're talking about, is the pause that God invites us to take before God fulfills the promise, whatever that promise might be. So I want to start by talking about what psychologists are calling the waiting epidemic. I think we all know that so many people have lost the ability to wait altogether. And really, it's no wonder, is it? We live in a time, in a world where it's possible to get the answer to any question instantly with Google. Look how Google served me with the seed picture, right? We can order coffee, we can order food for immediate pickup on an app. I did it yesterday. Man, efficiency is one of my favorite things. And yesterday, I managed to run into Target, order coffee, pull up to the gas tank, the pump, whatever, pay for the gas, put the thing in the, what is it? You guys know what I mean. You put the thing in the gas tank, and then walk in and get the coffee. Woo! So efficient, right? We can do that all the time. We can have stuff delivered to our house. We have access to everything we want on our phones, at our fingertips, with the push of a button. And yet, it is important. Efficiency is beautiful, but it is important for us to remember that not everything needs to happen at that speed, right? So it's hard. It's hard for us to deal with delays and unknowns when we're used to having so much accessible so quickly. So for many of us, the challenge of being patient, it's harder than ever before. The psychologists that have studied this epidemic, they found in a 2023 study that the average person's mood got steadily worse every minute they sat doing nothing, every minute they sat having to wait. Because waiting patiently is difficult. Waiting patiently causes us, because we get increasingly impatient, it's increasingly less efficient to wait, or we just want the outcome, right? Because that's so difficult, what we end up doing is we constantly check our phones for the updates, right? And how about when the thing doesn't load, right? Do we just push and push and push? I'm not going to lie. So that escape room we went to last night, we got to live this out in real time. I was thinking about this when I got home. Jay and I were in the same group. But it's a very interesting thing. You go into these rooms and you're timed, and so you just push things and you do things, right? It was such an amazing opportunity to stop and to look at what it means to read and to be patient and to take one step at a time. We're so used to doing everything so quickly, right? So if it's not technology that we're looking to update, to answer, whatever, we're looking for reassurance from the people around us or from the people that we come in contact with. We race to answers or solutions. If we can't find what we need quickly enough, then we come up with something. In fact, one of the things I've seen so much in the next generation is this creation of solutions, answers, narratives that may or may not actually have merit or evidence or anything. They just come up with things because they want to know. They want to know what to expect. They want to know what the outcome will be. Another psychologist said that technology creates the illusion that certainty is possible, which leads to trying to attain certainty in all situations, contributing to worry and anxiety. So not only do we get more frustrated, does our mood get worse when we sit waiting, but it increases our worry and anxiety, and don't we all know that to be true, right? When a loved one doesn't pick up the phone, we track their location now instead of waiting for them to call back. Guilty, right? Ken is laughing. It's not funny. Actually, it is. When an email doesn't get a prompt response, we look to see if it's been read, or a text. We can do that with text messages too if you've got on those read receipts. We look to see when it was read, and then, of course, that increases our concern about why there was no response, and it just feeds this epidemic. And so if that's true in our daily life, if waiting feels that hard in daily life, it's no surprise, is it, that waiting on God for healing, for answers, for direction feels even harder. And that's exactly why the discomfort of waiting matters. Because waiting helps us grow. We hate it, don't we? But it helps us grow. It shapes our character more than instant results ever could. And that is what God is in the business of doing, of shaping our character, of helping us develop into who God created us to be. And waiting helps us do that, as it increases our endurance. It allows our reality to align with God's timing. It deepens our dependence on God. And God's also in the business of that, of deepening our dependence on God. Because that's the whole design, to create a world in which we can do whatever we want, but God wants us to depend so deeply on God. Long before our reality, long before we tracked packages or checked read receipts, Paul described this much deeper waiting. That's a part of God's design. Waiting that's woven into the very fabric of our life and our life of faith. In Romans 8, what Jonathan read for us today, Paul talks about how all of creation is waiting. And isn't that what's so beautiful about plants? And the planting of a seed and the waiting to see them grow. All of creation is waiting. So as we groan and waiting, all of creation groans. As in that shared longing and wrestling, we wait for transformation. We wait to see God's glory. We wait to see what it is that we so desperately hope for to be revealed. Paul says in verse 18 that our current suffering will not be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. He says this because he understands that the walk of faith as a follower of Christ is a walk that follows Christ in every way, meaning that all believers are on the same course as Christ. And on that course, suffering and waiting are companions. Because before resurrection came crucifixion. Before glory comes groaning. God doesn't rush the healing or promise quick fixes. Instead, what God promises is presence. Presence in the slow, holy process where suffering that we so lament refines us and where waiting prepares us for what God is bringing next. I just got a text this morning that I was reminded of somebody who, they sent a text and were like, oh, I'm just so grateful for this community that they're a part of, whatever. And I was just reminded of their story. And in their story, they were miserable. They were miserable in their work, and they cried every day, and they sought counsel, and they wanted rescue, and they waited, and they weren't sure how long they could endure it. And then one day, God moved. And if I'll tell you that story all day long, but not right now. I got far more to say to tell you the whole story. So then God moved in the most incredible way, and they found out that there was this job opportunity that they were so perfectly suited for, a job that, frankly, the people who posted it weren't sure they'd find anybody to fill. And then it made its way to her, and she was perfectly equipped for it, and she applied for the job, and it was an immediate yes, and she has found this community that loves and supports her and cares for her in a way that she's never experienced before. That's the kind of work that God does. God doesn't rush healing. God doesn't promise quick fixes. Instead, God promises presence and movement in the slow, holy process where suffering refines us and where waiting prepares us for what God is bringing next. And the good news is that we are on the same course as Christ. The good news is that Jesus gets it. The good news is that because of who God is, glorification or our complete transformation and freedom is not just what might happen. It's not just what we hope will occur, but it's certainly what will happen. Because it's always and inevitably the outcome with God, which is why We can trust God even in the discomfort of waiting. Just as creation groans and waits, it also teaches us about waiting. An apple tree, much like so many other plants, but an apple tree, I want to tell you about an apple tree specifically, holds wisdom about patience that mirrors this truth that Paul is naming today. So there's a woman named Gladys who has always had an apple orchard at her home. But a few years back, her nephew paid her a visit, and he couldn't help but notice there was an especially huge harvest of apples. The branches, they were like hanging so heavy with all of the fruit. Some were even cracking from the weight of abundance. It had been so many years since anyone had seen a harvest like that. And so Gladys's nephew Keith asked her why that year was different. What did she do that made this harvest so bountiful? And she told him it was because the year before there was a late frost in the spring and all of the buds froze. All of the buds froze. And so Gladys said that when that happens, an apple tree does a miraculous thing. It stores up its energy in thousands of these small bumps or nodules, these offshoots called scions. So cut from producing fruit, the plant, the tree, it doesn't quit. It conserves. It gathers strength in hidden places. And all that energy and strength, it pulsates through that network of scions until the spring of the following year, and then bam! You have an explosion of buds as the tree unleashes all of that stored up energy. So what looks like dormancy, what feels maybe even hopeless in the freezing, is actually preparation. What seems dead is actually storing and restoring life. And so it is with us. And so it is with us. Our seasons of waiting are much the same. Some of our life's harshest frosts, they lead us into the unknown, the in-between, the unfathomable, and what can feel insurmountable or hopeless. But we're reminded by Paul today that the core of the Christian faith is that we get to live, even in waiting, with an incredible promise, which is what enables us to trust. Because of, in, and through Christ, we can have confidence that there will be an abundant harvest in our lives, no matter what suffering we endure. And that comes when we let God's power pulsate under and through the gnarly bark and the harsh frosts. And it's in and through Christ that we're given those offshoots of living hope. They don't look like much to begin with, but when we allow God to do the work of creating, we can trust that those frozen places will burst into life. That on the other side of our waiting, all of this stored up glory produced because of suffering will be unleashed into a joyful harvest. Faith is not only developed in unseen seasons, faith is proven in unseen seasons. And nowhere do we see this more clearly than the very reminder that we are preparing for the season of Advent. Because nowhere do we see how faith is developed and proven in unseen seasons than in the long, slow, sacred waiting for the Messiah. For generations, God's people held on to a promise that they could not see, trusting that God was still moving even in silence. It started 4,000 years ago when God appeared to Abraham and told him to leave his country and his relatives and everything that was familiar to him so that he could go to a land that God would show him. And God promised Abraham that he would make him into a great nation and that from Abraham's seed, all of the nations of earth would be blessed. Abraham believed and obeyed God, but he spent the rest of his life waiting for that promise to be fulfilled. And then nothing much happened for about 600 years, or at least it appeared that way. Life happened, lots happened, but they didn't see the promise yet. That was true for about 600 years. And then after centuries of continued growth and progress and multiplying in Egypt, Abraham's descendants became a real threat to Pharaoh. We know that story and how Pharaoh forced people into slavery. And so God raised up a man named Moses to deliver them. And once Moses led them and they arrived in the promised land, God's people waited another 400 years until God raised up a king named David. David wanted to build a house for God, but God said no and offered to build something even greater for David. God said, I will raise up your descendant after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom, and your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. And so David waited, but he never saw that promise fulfilled. 400 years later, 400 years after that, the nation of Israel was split in two, facing possible extinction. It was then that God raised up prophets like Isaiah, who you know is one of my favorites, who promised new life for the nation and the coming of the Messiah, who would deliver his people and restore them to glory. But it wasn't for another 500 years that this prophecy was fulfilled. A remnant of the nation of Israel had returned to the promised land, but it wasn't a glorious return. They were under the rule of Rome. The memory of the promises made to Abraham and Moses and David and Isaiah, they were still alive and well in the hearts of many Jews, but God's people were still waiting. They waited for 2,000 years. And then as Scripture says, when the set time had finally come, God sent his Son. From the very beginning, God planted that seed in and through God's promise to Abraham. Centuries later, Isaiah spoke of an offshoot from the stump of Jesse, new life springing from what looked cut down and hopeless. And in the fullness of time, that seed and that offshoot emerged in one person, Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah and the fruit of God's faithfulness, the harvest born from generations of groaning and hoping and trusting in the dark, in the devastating, in the suffering. And just as God brought his promise to life through Jesus after a long wait, God is doing something in us too. Always. And especially in our waiting. In our frozen seasons, in our impatience, in our long waits, even in our despair and disbelief, the living Christ is already at work beneath the bark, preparing an abundant harvest that we will see burst into glory. So I want to invite us to settle into waiting. Whatever it is that we're waiting for, settle into it. Because we know we can trust God in it. We know that we can trust God through it. So may we not look for quick fixes or race to answers and solutions that rely on our own understanding, that speak to our need for comfort. Instead, might we be comfortable with discomfort, because in it we are guaranteed, we are promised that we will see glory, beauty, and abundance. What's most critical is that we continue to follow faithfully what God has laid out as the path of the life of faith, being consistent, intentional, diligent, and focused, because that's all that we need for our waiting. God has told us what to do as we wait, and that's all we have to do, and we can do it knowing that if we will, that eventually what God is doing under the surface will burst forth and bloom. Amen.